Today's lecture will be by Dr. Josh Smith. You can see what the title is, so I don't need to repeat that. But Josh has been a volunteer with us for a long time, and I can vouch for him being an absolutely excellent guide. He's also got a significant role on our as a writer on our interpretation team. So this is a group that's actually working up some interesting material that we can use in our new interpretation area in the Undercroft once we can pay for it. And he's also been academically quite heavily involved in a research project between, I think, Stirling University, Glasgow and Scottish Arts or something, I can't remember what it was. Yeah. Looking at the wider picture of borrowers in the late 18th century and the early 19th century across Scotland, which is absolutely fascinating. So I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to it. So please, Josh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair. Wow, it's great to see so many faces here. It's a real honour to be asked to give this lecture. As Alistair said, I spent time alongside my PhD guiding at the Leighton, and it is really good fun to meet the range of visitors that come through the doors. But also, I suppose, rather selfishly, it's always good fun to talk about your research, and I get plenty of chance to do that guiding. But I've also had the benefit, really, of working alongside a really valuable team of dedicated guides whose knowledge of the library and of Dunblane goes much deeper than my own, and has really been beneficial to my own research, so thank you for that. What I'm going to argue today is that, as well as being Leighton's library, I think the Leighton Library has, for all its active existence, been a community library. And although its contextual circumstances have much changed in the 330 years or so since its founding, I think that remains the case today. It's a community library for the benefit of us all now, and certainly for Dunblane. Now, I was fortunate to do this research for a number of reasons. Fortunate to get funding for it, but also fortunate, as Alistair said, to do it at the same time that another project received funding at the same time. So this is the Books and Borrowing project, which, yes, was based jointly at universities of Stirling and Glasgow, and which ran between 2020 and 2024, and which aimed to uncover and reinterpret the history of reading in Scotland between 1750 and 1830. And to do that, the project took borrowing records from 18 historic libraries across Scotland, transcribed them, digitised them into a database of borrowings. The data in the project is all publicly available. It's free for anyone to use and free for anyone to search. Version 1 contains, these are records in version 1. It might be a bit difficult to see, but the Leighton's records are those in the turquoise blue. This is a close-up, a chart showing the Leighton's borrowings, which really cover the period 1780 to 1840, and as you can see, consist of 6,700 borrowing records, of 306 recorded borrowers, and 809 books. Now, this isn't all the Leighton surviving borrowing records. There are some records that go after 1840. Likewise, there's some records from the period 1699 to 1745, which haven't been transcribed, are not part of this project, and I didn't examine for the PhD. So I'm only focusing on the period 1780 to 1840 of the Leighton Library today. But having the data digitised, and this is an example, this is a book I'm going to be talking a lot about today, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And having the data digitised means that you can do quite interesting searches quite quickly. So, for example, we have a nice widget on the front page of the website, which tells us whether a book was borrowed on that day. And I can quite easily search for there are 18 borrowings made from the Leighton Library on this day across its history, including one made 228 years ago today by Mr. John Smith, no relation But on the 15th of November 1797, Smith returned the first volume of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and took out 2 volumes of William Robertson's History of Scotland. So any screenshots you see, and I do use a lot of them, are taken from the project website. Likewise, the Leighton's Borrowing Register and the minute books of its earliest minute book is digitised and available to view online as well. But my PhD was separate. There you go, that's what a page of a database looks like. Now, my PhD was separate to the project, and they examined the political significance of libraries like the Leighton became in the 18th century, which was a subscription library. Now, after 4 years of thinking about the Leighton's records, of course, I have a lot to say. What I'm going to focus on today is one main argument, really, is that I consider the Leighton Library of the late 18th century less as Robert Leighton's library and more as a subscription library for a community in Dunblane. So by that I mean to say that the Leighton's trustees consciously broadened the reach and purpose of the library and were either imitating, or at the very least mirroring, the structures and procedures of subscription libraries elsewhere. Now, I don't mean to overstress the social reach the library had. At least in the period in which I examine it, you always had to pay to use the library. But this is no different to most libraries of the period. So it's still a community library, even if it's for a community of paying subscribers. So what do I mean by a subscription library? Well, historians typically define these as any permanent stock of books that are administered and managed for a community of subscribers. So they're not public libraries, although they're often called as such, because you had to, most of the time you had to pay to access them, either a one-off fee or an annual fee. But critically, these libraries were everywhere by the end of the 18th century. So one recent estimation is that there's over 350 active subscription libraries active across the British Isles and North America by 1800. And for Scotland specifically, estimations by scholars vary between 52 and 100 active by 1800. And you can see there's a list of subscription libraries founded locally to Dunblane. There are many more subscription libraries founded after 1809. So the Leighton was unique in that it wasn't founded with the purpose of being a subscription library. Of course, it came from the collection of one man, Robert Leighton, the former Bishop of Dunblane. And Leighton's last will and testament in 1684 noted that he left his books to the Cathedral of Dunblane in Scotland to remain there for the use of the clergy of that diocese. And the absence of a formal founding document gave the Leighton's 18th century trustees a rather blank canvas to shape the library in whichever way they saw fit. Now, in most instances, subscription libraries were collectively managed. And by that I mean it was the members themselves that decided aspects of their administration. So oftentimes administrative committees were elected from the general membership, and this is an additional political aspect of these libraries. But this isn't the case at the Leighton, where the trustees were appointed rather than elected. So after the library's founding in 1688, it took some time for the administrative structuring of it to be settled. About 13 years, really. Just a small matter of revolution in 1688, Jacobites, the Presbyterian settlement in the Church of Scotland. But when it was finally settled in 1701, the system established that there would be 7 trustees that would administer the library in perpetuity. So the minister of Dunblane was a trustee by virtue of his office, but 2 further ministers from the Church of Scotland were to be appointed by the local synod. And 4 trustees were to come from the landed families that were instrumental to the library's founding. So this included the heirs of Cromlix, Aberrookhill and Bannockburn House. And here are some portraits of some of those landed trustees. Unfortunately, we don't have any portraits really of church ministers who were trustees to the library. So the surviving portraits kind of skews towards that extent. So it's these individuals that decided the library's administration in the 18th century. Now, despite their social narrowness, these individuals were conscious of their responsibility to manage the library for its community of users. And they increasingly formalised access to the library over the course of the 18th century. As Gordon Willis has persuasively argued, we actually think that access to the library was quite probably free up until 1734. But after 1734, members had to pay a one-off fee and they had to sign the matriculation book. And in 1789, that one-off fee was changed to an annual subscription. Now, in overseeing these changes, the trustees were not changing the library into a secular institution. And it remained as closely connected to the Church of Scotland as it had always been. Indeed, people in the church, ministers in the Church of Scotland, were given preferential membership. So even after the Leighton required an annual subscription to join, ministers of the Kirk were only required to pay a one-off fee and remained a member for as long as they remained a minister within the local area. Similarly, university students in divinity and preachers, so that is those that have passed their religious trials but have yet to be given a permanent ministership, were also able to freely borrow from the library, provided they received the written support of their local minister. And this is an extract from the minutes laying that out. So these individuals were amongst the most regular borrowers from the library. Now, these pie charts are taken from the Books and Borrowing project, and they break down the occupations of recorded Leighton borrowers between 1780 and 1840. So the pie chart on the left is simply what occupations are present at the Leighton, but the chart on the right is what percentage of borrowings each of these occupations made. So, for example, if we look at look at this segment here. So this is ministers. We can say that despite constituting just less than 20% of Leighton borrowers, church ministers, and this includes ministers of all denominations, were responsible for 35% of borrowings. So they were responsible for more borrowings than their numbers would suggest. The same is true for authors. So there's this orange colour here. By contrast, the pink, university students borrowed less than their numbers would suggest. Surprisingly. But all this is to say that church ministers were amongst the most regular borrowers from the library. Now, a similar tale is told by the Leighton's list of top 10 recorded borrowers. So 7 of these individuals are church ministers, with 5 members of the Church of Scotland. You'll notice there are 2 ministers of Dunblane on this list, John Robertson at number 5, and Robert Sterling at number 1. And of course, these individuals live literally next door to the library, and they're also trustees. 2 other individuals, so Christopher Tate at number 4, and James Campbell at number 3, are also library trustees, and I think it's notable that these individuals, along with Sterling and Robertson, make up 4 of the library's top 5 most prolific borrowers. And the extent to which these individuals used the library is almost certainly undercounted by the surviving records. Because, so this is a page, this is Robert Sterling's final borrowing page in the main register, and there's a note at the bottom which reads, "Carried to another book, kept for the trustees only." And unfortunately that book hasn't survived. So we know trustees made more use of the library than the surviving records can tell us. But the Leighton was never a sectarian institution. you'll notice that the Leighton's second most prolific borrower is a name some people in here might recognise, the Reverend Michael Gilfillan, who used the library across a span of, well, who we have recorded borrowings from him across a span of 35 years between 1780 and 1815. Now, Gilfillan wasn't a minister of the Church of Scotland, but rather of the Burgher Secession Church, what would eventually become the United Free Church. And despite the offer of congregations in Edinburgh and Glasgow, Gilfillan's biography records that he remained in Dunblane because he was attached to, quote, its excellent public library, by which they mean the Leighton. Indeed, the biography went on. Such was the studious life which Mr. G led, that almost every book of value in it he had read with care, and some of them more than once. And of course, with the borrowing records, we can say that that's not necessarily an exaggeration. In 1792, the library's minute book records that Gilfillan put this intimate knowledge of the Leighton's books to use when he helped the librarian with the creation of the first printed catalogue. Now, despite providing this aid seemingly for free, and being a regular user of the library, as a minister for the Secession Church, Gilfillan was not entitled to the preferential membership given to ministers of the Church of Scotland. So remember, ministers of the Church of Scotland only needed to pay a one-off fee to acquire membership. By contrast, Gilfillan would have had to have paid an annual subscription. And he would have been liable for this annual subscription had he not donated a book to the library in 1776, the 4-volume History of the Reformation by Gerald Brandt, which is still in the collection today, but for which there are no recorded borrowings of it ever being made. But nevertheless, in return for this donation, the trustees gave him civis membership. Now, as I said, Gilfillan was appointed as Secession Minister in 1768 to a congregation that had originally split from the Church of John Robertson in 1757. Now, as you can see here, of course, Robertson, as the Minister of Dunblane, was the 5th most prolific recorded borrower. And the library use would have brought the two men together on a regular basis. So did Robertson hold any malice towards the man that now headed his secessionist congregation? Well, no, it's quite the opposite, actually, because it seems that both men's use of the library actually formed a close and lasting relationship. So Gilfillan's biographer records how Robertson and Gilfillan walked together a short while every day, and by their communication of what they had read, contributed to the improvement of each other. So it's also notable that when Gilfillan came to be admitted a library member, it was Robertson who presented his donation to the trustees on his behalf. So this is an example of the ecumenical diversity of the Leighton. So the library was used most prominently by ministers of the Church of Scotland, but its membership also included individuals from various secession churches, as well as from the Scottish Episcopal Church. But together this explains why contemporaries and indeed some historians have often classified the Leighton as a religious library. Now, part of this is Leighton's legacy itself, and he remained a popular and well-known figure throughout the 18th century. There's no doubt that some people also became Leighton members because its founding collection provided them access to older and more valuable books than they were able to get elsewhere. So one example of this, possibly the Leighton's most famous borrower in this period, at least to a historic audience, would have been Mr. James Bruce of Kinnaird, who achieved his celebrity by claiming to have discovered the source of the Nile in 1770. It actually wasn't the Nile, it was only a tributary of the Nile, and it had actually already been discovered by a Spanish explorer in the same century. But it didn't stop Bruce. But Bruce's use of the Leighton was highly selective. So he subscribed to the library on the 28th of December 1791, and he borrowed only the first volume of the Polyglot Bible, which, as any guides will know, is a large folio printing of the Bible translated into 9 different languages. Here is an image of it. So, this book, and it's still in the Leighton today, had originally been owned by Leighton. It was his most expensive book. And we can presume that Bruce used it for its translation of the Ethiopic language, which was the language of the area of Africa in which he visited. So here's an example of Bruce seeking out the Leighton because it's a specialised collection, and he has a specific purpose in doing so. In a similar vein, here we have the page in the borrowing register which records a series of borrowings made by David Doig. Now, David Doig was the master of Stirling Grammar School, and he used the Leighton between 1786 and 1799. So here, Doig is apparently taking out 18 books at once on New Year's Day in 1787. And you see, the image isn't great, but these are a series of Greek and Latin texts. And his first borrowing reads Plato Ficino. Now, Ficino is the name of the Italian scholar who edited Plato's work. And rather helpfully, I don't know if it's the librarian or Doig, has written in a very old copy, which is actually the 1602 folio edition. So again, somebody seeking out the library for its valuable collection of works. But we know from the Leighton surviving minute book that its trustees greatly expanded on the founding collection, and they purchased and received new books throughout the 18th century. It is these newer texts that were more likely to be borrowed by later 18th century members. So, for example, none of the books from Leighton's founding collection are amongst the 100 top borrowed books by Leighton borrowers. But religion remained a major feature of the collection. It's the second most popular borrowed genre, at least theology is, behind only history, and this explains why visitors continue to classify the Leighton as a religious library. Now, an example of this is in the epigraph, which stands as the title to my talk, The Best Theological Library in Scotland. And this is taken from a travel account written by the writer Elizabeth Isabella Spence in 1816. So Spence visited Dunblane and discussed her visit here. And she describes how the Leighton remains a consistent draw for visitors, or the Leighton Library remains a consistent draw to visitors. She describes his guardian spirit as hovering over Dunblane. And it's clear that she sees the library as very much an intellectual memorial to Leighton. It was the best theological library in Scotland, she thought, the library of the universities and advocates in Edinburgh accepted, though she regretted that the library's funds were so greatly depleted that it, quote, can hardly support a librarian and purchase many expensive books. Worse still, she thought, quote, I cannot say that I think the curators of late always employed these funds in the best manner for promoting the object of the pious founder. Now, the wrong books in Spence's mind were modern works of fiction, and particularly the novel. And this is a view we see regularly in this period, that novels are thought of as ephemeral, they're potentially corrupting, and worst of all, they are feminine. But fortunately, Spence could record that, quote, the present minister of Dunblane has indeed been more attentive than his predecessor to that object, for during his incumbency, I cannot learn that any novel has found its way into the library. Now, the present minister at the time was Robert Stirling, who we've already met. And Spence was more wrong than she realised, because Stirling had actually overseen 2 novels entering the collection, of 2 modern novels at least. John Moore's Gothic novel Zerluco, and Elizabeth Hamilton's Cottages of Glenburnie. And here is the borrowing of Zerluco. We know this was definitely popularly borrowed. And it's actually the 6th most popular borrowing overall by Leighton members, which is quite staggering when it's only held in 2 volumes. Moreover, rather than just being lax in his pious duties, the minister of Dunblane had actually been instrumental in the introduction of at least one of these works of fiction into the library. And the minutes record that it was Robert Stirling's own copy of Hamilton's novel, which he had sold to the library in 1808 for a price of 7 shillings and 6 pence. So Spence was very wrong indeed. But this is a reminder once again that whilst visitors to the Leighton continue to see the library as Leighton's library, it always had a broader reach and remit. And we can see this in the range of individuals that subscribed to it, and which extended beyond the clerical community. And these individuals are typical for the types of people we would expect to subscribe to a subscription library anyway. What we might refer to as the professional classes or the emerging middle classes. And this is a community of library borrowers who know each other, they exchange books, they exchange letters, and they exchange ideas on a regular basis. So one excellent example of this is the writer and correspondent John Ramsay of Optative. Now Ramsay is a somewhat eccentric figure. He was locally very well known, and he was visited by both Burns and Scott. And a selection of his correspondence survives today. Now in these letters, Ramsay frequently commented on his reading, including in many instances on books he had borrowed from the Leighton Library. And you can see we have 183 borrowings he made between 1785 and 1815, but we know that he was a library member since 1762. So there's possibly another 23 years of, may have made another 23 years of library use. Now he mentions at least 21 other Leighton members in his correspondence, including David Doig, of course, from Ashford Stirling Grammar School, we've already met. Now when Doig died in 1800, Ramsay raised a tablet to his memory in his own garden. Yet one fellow Leighton member with whom Ramsay did not get on well with was his local minister, the Reverend Christopher Tate, who, as I'm sure you remember, was a Leighton trustee. He was the 4th most prolific Leighton borrower. Now Ramsay once called the Tates, "'Tis a strange, not a holy family." And he frequently visited other parish churches rather than his own. And he recorded on one occasion in which Mrs. Tate and her niece visited Ramsay before he died to request that his funeral cortege would pass behind their manse rather than in front of it. Essentially, they didn't want to see his coffin go past. And apparently, Ramsay gave that a hearty laugh and invited them both in for tea. And yet, despite making a combined 455 borrowings across 26 years in which they both used the library, there are no occasions at all in which Ramsay and Tate found themselves in the library at the same time, which was perhaps on purpose. So this is an example of library sociability not working, but we have other examples of it playing an important role in drawing together people for a common purpose, not least in Dunblane itself. So included amongst the Leighton's borrowers are 61 women, and the most famous of these is probably Anne Grant, who subscribed to the Leighton for 2 years between 1804 and 1806 when she lived at Wood End, which is just outside Stirling. Now Grant was a poet and correspondent. She moved to Edinburgh in 1810, but she enjoyed this local area and she periodically came back during the summer months between 1816 and 1819. Now, during one of these visits in 1816, she recorded her description of life in Dunblane. It's about half a dozen pretty, genteel houses surrounded with far prettier gardens in the town, where the under-sheriff and his brother, who was librarian to Bishop Leighton's excellent library, and postmaster besides, a clergyman and a wealthy architect who has a fine house and garden, all reside and form the aristocracy of the town. In such a humble aristocracy, I should have included the schoolmaster, who is a man of letters, and the collector. Now, of course, all these people who Grant references are or would later be Leighton members. William Stirling may not have been a Leighton member, but he did repair the library, undertook major repairs to the library in 1815. He lived on top of Home Hill, and actually his gravestone is literally just outside his door in the graveyard here in Dunblane. Now, in referring to these individuals as the aristocracy of the town, Grant is not calling them an actual landed aristocracy. But she is instead referring to Dunblane's chief inhabitants. So it's social leaders, which are both religious and legal. Now, between these individuals, shared membership of the subscription library was another connection and support amidst already existing social, political, and familial connections. Now, of course, this was a conscious decision by the Leighton's trustees to administer the library in this way, and to take and adapt Leighton's original vision for the library as one for the clergy of the diocese, and to broaden it into a wider library for subscribers. So this meant that, as I said, access to the library was slowly formalised over the course of the 18th century. As we've seen, and as this shows, from 1734, individuals needed to pay a one-off fee and sign this book, the matriculation book, before they were allowed to borrow. And from 1789, that's changed to an annual subscription. Now, in 1815, the library allows visitors to temporarily subscribe on a fortnightly basis, and that opens the library up to seasonal visitors who come to Dunblane, Lanc, and Grant. And here is the borrowing book that the trustees specifically purchased to record borrowings made by these seasonal visitors. Now, other changes are made to access over time. So from 1789, any individual needed the consent of 2 trustees before they could be admitted a member. At the same time, the length of the time a book may be borrowed was outlined, and the fines liable for exceeding these. And all these rules are listed, were listed at the front of the library's first printed catalogue, published in 1793, which is pictured here. So that the 2 images on the right are a digitised copy that I found online. The image from the left is from an annotated copy of the Leighton's catalogue, which is at the National Library of Scotland, which is clearly owned by a former library member who has added in additional details. But putting together a catalogue in this way and formalising these rules, I think is, in some respects, a bit performative. And the Leighton may have been influenced by other libraries elsewhere, and I can talk more about those in the Q&A if people wish. So what do I mean by it being performative? Well, so for example, although prospective members had to receive the consent of 2 trustees, there's no evidence that anyone was ever barred library membership on these grounds. Likewise, the case with fines. So rather clearly outlined, if you exceeded the borrowing length, you had to pay a shilling for every month over that. And yet, there's only one recorded instance of fines ever being levied in almost 9 decades of records for the Leighton Library. So one borrowing record out of 6,737. Now, who do we think the unfortunate Leighton borrower was? Well, of course, it's Michael Gifford, the secessionist minister who is the second most prolific borrower. And he paid 2 shillings for 3 overdue volumes in May 1803. And perhaps this is John Robertson, the Minister of Dunblane, finally getting his revenge. But it's unlikely, because in truth, fines are rarely enforced at any subscription libraries in this period. So the Leighton is not unique for, despite the fact it's coming up with these fines, not enforcing them at all. But it's the fact that the Leighton's trustees felt the need to introduce such regulations, I think, is telling. And equally telling, oh, there we go, that's a zoomed in of Gil Filman's paying his fines. Now, equally telling is the way the library was described over time. It was the Leightonian Library of Dunblane, thereby centring its place in the local community. And this sense of place was further strengthened after 1787, when the newly appointed librarian was asked to write only the words Library of Dunblane on the title pages of the library's books. And many of the books in the library's collection today still have this written on their title page. So the sense of place and community was important. Even if it wasn't a socially diverse group, there's still a political significance to that. And this is a place in which books and ideas can be shared, but also in which people can make social connections. So, to conclude, I'll focus on one of these connections, one of these networks in the library, which combine both Enlightenment thought but also political conspiracy. So the Leighton is an excellent example of an Enlightenment library because there are a number of works that are central to the English and Scottish Enlightenment. And the Leighton was exceptionally quick in the purchase of many of these texts. So this is a list of the books ordered by the Leighton's trustees in a meeting in 1776. And you'll notice that we have Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations here again. You notice that most of these books are ordered in the year of their publication or within a couple of years in their publication. Indeed, Robert Watson's work is not yet published, so they're really up to date with the latest bibliographical trends. Now, another work which epitomises this Enlightenment spirit and the Enlightenment spirit is the third edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Now, of course, this is a general knowledge encyclopedia which consists of a series of essays designed to demonstrate the extent of human knowledge. And it's emblematic of the Enlightenment idea that through rational and empirical inquiry, the world is knowable and definable. So, the Leighton actually has 2 copies of the third edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica in its collection. So the lower rung are the copies that were borrowed by Leighton readers in the 1790s. The copies above were donated to the library by the Stirlings of Keir at some point. But these bottom row were definitely borrowed by Leighton members. And in fact, the library purchases the encyclopedia from 1791 onwards as new volumes are published. And it's actually the second most popular work to be borrowed by Leighton members on 156 occasions between 1792 and 1840. Now, the Encyclopaedia Britannica had a personal connection to the Leighton in that the editor of this third edition was a Leighton member, George Glebe, who was an Episcopal minister from Stirling and who would later be the head of the Episcopal Church. Now, Glebe wrote a number of articles for the encyclopedia himself, but as editor he also employed other people to write other articles, and some of these were also Leighton members, including David Doig, a master of Stirling Grammar School. So he wrote articles on mythology and mysteries. Now for Glebe, the Encyclopaedia Britannica wasn't just an intellectual exercise, but it was also a political exercise. Writing in the introduction to its supplement, which the Leighton also holds, Glebe explained that he intended it to, quote, to counteract, quote, the seeds of anarchy and atheism disseminated by its French equivalent. And this was even more important in the years after the French Revolution in 1789. So during the 1790s, a number of conservative writers popularised the theory that the British state was threatened by an international conspiracy of British radicals, French revolutionaries, Masonic lodges, and secret societies such as the Illuminati. And all of these groups were intent on subverting morality and overturning the state and organised religion. Now, historians have concluded that this is all utter nonsense, but it's an attempt to make sense of the bewildering variety of changes which affected Europe in the aftermath of the French Revolution. And Glebe accepted wholesale this Illuminati theory. He made a number of strident declarations against it from his pulpit in Stirling. So in 1797, Glebe warned that the revolution in France was the, quote, offspring of infidelity. Quote, of our young men bred to the liberal professions, 2/3 at least are avowed infidels, and indulge, of course, without compunction, in the practice of every vice and fashion that which has not been made dishonourable. We find professed infidels at every table, and no man can be sure that the stranger who sits next to him shall not, before he rise, break an impious jest on the object of his adoration. So basically, be careful who you sat next to, because chances are he's an atheist. Now, by 1802, Glebe is even more sure of his concerns. Quote, that these debasing principles and gross practices have spread over the northern nations of Europe, I need not go about to prove. That we have drunk deep of the corrupted stream of modern Illuminism is evident to demonstration from the vehement asseverations which we everywhere hear that the whole story of Illuminism is a fable. So essentially, the more you say this is untrue, actually only shows how true it actually is, according to Gleig. And Gleig included similar warnings such as these in several of his essays in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. Now, two of the most prominent British works, which popularised this theory by John Robertson and James Thomson, were both present and borrowed from the Leighton Library during this period. Indeed, one of these individuals, James Thomson, was himself a Leighton member. And he was a Leighton member during the time in which he wrote his work, which he titled The Rise, Progress and Consequences of the New Opinions and Principles Lately Introduced into France. And Thomson borrows from the library between 1797 and 1802, whilst he works as a tutor to the sons of John Stirling of Kidden Davy. Now, he's a licensed preacher, which means he gets free access to the library. And he donates a copy of his work to the library in 1800, and that's a book that is still in the collection today. But Thomson also knew Gleig personally, because he had served as an assistant editor on the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And this is a connection between the two men and the Leighton Library that previous scholars have not been aware of. Now, although Thomson resigned his post as an assistant editor after only a year, his membership of the Leighton allowed him to maintain contact with Gleig. And the two men may have met together in the library when they came to take out books. So, as they both did on the 25th of December, 1800. So, this is Gleig's borrowing of George Campbell on the Gospels at above, and this is Thomson's Geraldine Genius, a book that was ordered in 1776, if you will remember. So they're possibly both in the library together on Christmas Day in 1800. And this is interesting because Gleig's most direct reference to the dangers posed by modern Illuminism comes during this period. In the sermon in which I quoted from, and at the same time as he's writing his preface to the Encyclopaedia Britannica. And, as we can see, as Gleig, Thomson, and the works of both men are all present at the Leighton Library. So in this respect, the library may have acted as an essential catalyst in an ecumenical, intellectual, and political partnership. Now, the Leighton is not unusual for having these kind of networks of views, and many of these same fears and conspiracies are present at other British subscription libraries. Nor were these ideas necessarily incompatible with ideas that we might associate as being progressive. So, for example, Gleig was a strident abolitionist, and he used his encyclopedia essays on slavery to denounce the practice on both moral and practical grounds. But it demonstrates, I think, the significance of subscription libraries like the Leighton. And that significance is both intellectual and social. It explains why so many individuals chose to subscribe to libraries like the Leighton. And it shows why the Leighton's trustees chose to administer the library in such a way. It was a unique collection, but also typical of what a subscription library could be in this period. And critically, it had gone from beyond a library for only the clergy of the diocese, as Leighton had outlined in his will, and had become a library for a wider community of subscribers. And such a change was a conscious decision that was taken by the Leighton's trustees, taken by those who administered the library after Leighton, and who administered his library as a library for subscribers, but also a library for Dunblane. Thank you very much.